Hi guys, welcome back to the channel. Hope you all are doing well. Today we're going to take a look at Amazon's message queuing service called SQS. We're going to take a look at what SQS is and how you can use it. Then we're going to use Python to do some of the basic operations of SQS, such as creating a queue, writing to a queue, and consuming from a queue. After that, we're going to talk about some of the more high-level theoretical concepts, such as how you can have first in, first out logic in SQS, and also how you can do exactly once processing in this queuing service. At the end, we're gonna talk about a more automated pipeline where you can write to AWS using another service called SNS and consume from it through Lambda. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is, in high level, what SQS is and how you're going to use it. Essentially, SQS is nothing but a queue. What you do is you can insert messages into the queue and then consume from the queue too. In this case, you can see to the left, we have message. So this is how the messages are getting ingested into SQS. And then to the right, you have different services that are reading independently from the queue. This kind of architecture is very useful when your publisher and consumer are publishing and consuming messages at different rates. Let's say you have such a high volume publisher that your consumers cannot really keep up if you keep on directly writing to the consumer. In that case, instead, you can start writing to the queue and your consumers can just read from the queue at their own pace. There is going to be some latency in this system, but at least you can guarantee that your consumers are reading and processing all the messages in the queue. So the queue essentially works as a short-time buffer for your messages while your consumers are reading from it and processing it one by one. Alright, so that is in high level what SQS is. And now let's jump into the code to show you how some of the operations work. The first thing you see over here is I am logged into my AWS console, but you don't see any queue right now because we did not really create any. So the first thing we're going to take a look at is how can you create a queue using Python. Typical to all other services in AWS, you use Boto3 client to instantiate your SQS client. There you go. And the first thing we're going to look at is how do you create the queue. So creating a queue is very straightforward. All you do is sqs.createQueue, and then you give your queue a name. Let's say it's test, and then you can give it a bunch of attributes, but we're going to use the default because we don't really want to customize anything. Let's print out the URL of the queue, and then let's print out all the default attributes. Okay. So I'm gonna put this one here. There you go. And now let's do sqs.py. All right, there you go. So you see we get the URL of the queue, which is essentially a ID and then test. And then these are all the attributes. Most of these are customizable. So you could customize your queue as much as you want. I'm gonna link the documentation in the description so that you can take a look at what are the different configurations available to you. But for now, you can take a look at the default ones we have here. All right, and then if I go ahead and refresh now, why don't I see my queue here? Maybe it's the region. Give me 1 second. Might be a region thing. Yeah, there you go. So I changed the region and you see we have the new test queue right here. From this dashboard, you can see how many messages are available, how many are in flight, and if you have content-based deduplication set. We're going to talk about that at the end, but the dashboard is a good way for you to take a look at very quickly how many messages are there in the queue right now. All right, so that is pretty much how you create a queue. Very straightforward. So I'm going to go ahead and comment it out. The next thing we are going to take a look at is how can you use an existing queue. Okay, so use an existing queue. This is very straightforward. All you have to do is QUE. Oops, there you go. So all you have to do is do SQS.getQueue by name, and then you pass it the name. In our case it's test, and then let's just print the queue out once again, the URL. And you can see we have a reference to the queue just by using the method getQueue by name. All right. So that's how you get reference to an existing queue. The next thing we're going to take a look at is how can you take a look at all the queues that you have. So we're going to do list all available queues. Okay. So we're going to have a for loop, which is going to go through sqs.queues.all. And then let's just print the URL of the queue. Okay. So right now you can see we're getting test. Let's go ahead and create another queue. All right, so we're gonna comment these out, and then let's just call it, let's say test2, run it, and then we're also gonna do a test3. So we're gonna have 3 queues, okay? All right, so now that we have 3 queues, let's go to our dashboard and do a refresh. And you see we have test, test2, and test3. So let's go ahead and list the available queues now. All you're doing is sqs.queues.all, and then we're printing the URL. We are not getting it. Why are we not getting it? List all the available queues, and then for queues.all. Might be a region thing. Not sure why it's going to be a region. Oh, there you go. So there is a slight delay between you creating a queue and then it becoming available. So I think like it's 10 or 15 seconds. So yeah, now you can see we have all 3 queues right here. All right, so that's how you list all the available queues that you have under your user. Now we're gonna do the fun one, which is gonna be send message to a queue. Okay. So this is very straightforward too. The first thing is you need a reference to your existing queue. So we're going to use getQueue by name and give it the name of the queue, which we'll use test. And then all you do is queue.sendMessage, and then you give it a message body parameter where it's going to be your message. Okay, so let's run it. All right, it ran successfully. Let's go to our dashboard and do a refresh. So it takes a while for the change to reflect on this dashboard, but you can see we have messages available 1. Okay, so if we do, let's create another message and then run it again. So we run this line of code again. We should expect to see 2 messages available now. Once again, it's going to take a few minutes or seconds to reflect. Before that, it might be a bit glitchy, but here you go. We have 2. Let's do, so we have test2 and test3. Let's write to test2, and then let's write to test3. Okay, we're gonna do a refresh. We're gonna give it a second for the data to be consistent. Sometimes it takes a minute. So we have 2 messages in test. These are the 2 messages we wrote at the beginning. And then we wrote to test2. So you have 1 message available here. And then we wrote to test3. So you have 1. The number you see here, it can be a bit inconsistent. But if you actually look at the queue data itself, you will see all your messages still there. It's just a dashboard that tends to be a bit glitchy at times. All right, so that's how you write. You can also do all sorts of things when writing. You can add meta attributes. You can add system meta attributes. I am going to link the documentation in the description. So take a look at all the complex things you can do when writing to the queue. But this should be a good example of a simple message and how you can write it to the queue. All right, so this was an example of writing 1 message into the queue. Now let's see, instead of writing 1 at a time, how can you write a batch of messages? Okay, so we're going to look at send bulk messages to queue. Okay, I'm going to comment this out. Okay, so how can you send a bunch of messages together? Okay, so once again, we're gonna get a reference to our queue. Let's use our first one called test. We're gonna start with 0, and then we're gonna have an array for all a list for all the messages. Then we're gonna iterate from 0 to 5. And for every time, we're gonna append a message, which is gonna be an ID. This is gonna be the string version of the count. And then we have our message body. And this is gonna be a formatted string. You can just do whatever, but I'll just do that. All right, and then once you have a message appended, you increment plus equals 1. Okay, so essentially what we're doing is we are iterating from 0 to 4, and every single time we append a new message to this messages list. So at the end of this for loop, we should have 5 distinct messages in that messages array. And then finally, you can do queue.send messages. So the key distinction, this one is message and this one is messages. And then it takes in entries, and this should be your messages. Okay. So once we run it, we should expect 5 new messages to be appended to the queue name test. Right now, test has 2 messages. So after some glitchy behavior, we should expect around 7 after we run this piece of code. All right, so we ran it ran, refresh. Yeah, so we should expect some delay because the UI is a bit glitchy, but it should update in a bit. So we'll give it a moment for it to reflect. And there you go. So we started with 2, now we're at 7. That's because we had 2 before and we added 5. So that's how you can write in bulk to SQS. And previously we saw how you can write 1 message at a time. All right, so now that we have seen how to write all the messages, let's go ahead and see how you can read these messages. All right. All right, so read messages. So first we're gonna get a reference to our queue once again. Okay, there you go. So now we could do for message in queue.receive messages. Okay. So this is where it gets a bit tricky. So the method we're going to use is called receive messages, and then we're going to pass it a few attributes. Okay. So the first one is going to be a parameter called attribute names, and we're going to set it to all. So this essentially tells SQS that for every message, give me all the attributes there are. Then we're going to do max number of messages and set it to 10. This means at once, I want to read 10 messages. So instead of reading 1 by 1, I'm telling SQS, give me 10 messages at a time. Okay. And then we're going to print the message.body. Okay. So I'm going to zoom out 1 level. There you go. Yes. So now the key thing is, let me try running it. Wait, what? So receive messages and then attribute. Did I? Oh yeah, there should be attribute names. Okay. Right. So let's do this one thing. Okay. So messages in flight and messages available is 6. All right. So by default, what happens is you read 1 message at a time, right? So if we do this and run it, you get the message hello world 2. So remember we were writing messages, so this is one of them. If we run it again, you're getting 2 other messages. Again, you're getting 3 other messages. So one thing to note is when you're reading messages, this is not ordered, right? So you're not reading it in the same order that you wrote the messages in, because then you would have gotten 0 first, 1, and then 2, and then 3. So by default, SQS does not retain order. If you want to have a first in, first out, or FIFO queue, there is a way to do it, and we're going to talk about it at the end. But the key thing for you to remember is by default, SQS, the queue is not ordered. So don't expect to read in the same order that you wrote in. But yeah, you can see we use receive messages to just like read messages from the queue. Okay. All right. Okay, so that is about reading. Now, one thing you could do is as you are reading, you could delete the messages, right? To guarantee that once you have processed the message, it should be deleted from the queue. And the way you do that is you just do a message.delete. Let's run it. So it read this one message and it should be deleted. Let's just run it a bunch of times and then you can get an idea. So we read 1 more, that should be deleted. We read 3 more and that should be deleted. 2 more, that should be deleted. Now we don't see any more messages. If we do a refresh here, you see we're back to 0 and 0. So after consuming every message, we went ahead and deleted it from the queue. So that's how you can guarantee that every time you process a message, it's deleted from the queue so that you don't reprocess every single time. However, to be 100% guaranteed that you have exactly once processing, there are a few other things you have to do, and we're going to talk about that next. Okay, so that's not what I wanted. So the first thing we want is to talk about FIFO queues a bit. Okay. So I'm going to link this in the description too, but essentially to have a FIFO delivery logic, which means you read in the same order that you wrote, you have to go ahead and, what's that called? You have to go ahead and add a few new things to your queue. The first thing is going to be you need to give it a message group ID, and you also need to give it some deduplication ID. I would recommend you read this document over here, but it is fairly straightforward to customize the SQS queue to be first in, first out. And once you configure it, I don't think you need to worry too much about reading out of order. Very similarly, you can also have exactly once processing. And the way it's going to work is you need to give it, you need to enable something called content-based deduplication. What this is going to do is it's going to deduplicate messages in your queue by generating a SHA-256 hash of your message body. This is how it's going to know if let's say the same message was published 2-3 times, and when you process it, you're gonna compute the hash, and if you see that you already processed something with the same hash, you're just gonna ignore it. Okay, so you could do a content-based deduplication. This way it's just a boolean you set, a true or a false, and you don't need to write custom logic for it. But you can also go ahead and write your own ID, like a deduplication ID. That way you handle the deduplication where you explicitly tell SQS if it's a duplicate message. So yeah, those are the 2 ways to do exactly once processing in SQS. This is not out of the box. You will have to configure it. Similarly, the queue, the SQS queue is not a FIFO queue by default. You will have to configure that too. But doing both is fairly straightforward, and I'm pretty sure I'll have a video next where you're gonna see how you can do both. All right, now the last thing we're going to take a look at is a more automated way of doing things. So let's look at our test queue over here. So you see it says no Amazon SNS subscriptions. Okay. And another thing is if you look at, I don't know if you can see it over here, but essentially we don't have a trigger. So we don't have anything downstream running when a message is coming to the queue. What we essentially did here is manually we were sending messages to the queue, and manually we were reading from the queue too. But if you are in the AWS ecosystem, you can use other AWS services to make the process more seamless. So what you could do is you could subscribe to a Amazon SNS topic, which is a simple notification service topic. That way what's going to happen is whenever you publish a message to SNS, your queue is going to be notified of that message. And the moment your queue is notified of that message, the message is going to end up in the queue. And then you can trigger a Lambda function based on that. So let me just do this over here. So you could do so this is the manual one, right? So we are manually publishing a message. It's ending up in the queue. And then from individual services, we are polling the queue to read messages. But you could automate the whole process by doing something like this. So you could have AWS SNS. Okay, so you could have this, and then you have your queue. So automatically SNS is gonna write to your queue. Okay, so you just publish to SNS, it automatically writes to the queue. And then you have, let's say this one. And then you have like a Lambda function. Okay, so you have, I don't know why it's asking me for that. What? There you go, okay. Yeah, so you write to SNS, and if your SQS is configured to listen to an SNS topic, the data is already immediately going to be in the queue. And if you add a trigger, which is a Lambda function, you can trigger a Lambda function based on the message in the queue. This way you can keep publishing to SNS at whatever rate you want to publish in. SNS should automatically put the message into SQS, and then your Lambda function will be triggered automatically every time there is a new message in SQS. If you want your Lambda function to process the messages in order, we talked about how you can configure your queue to be a FIFO queue. Similarly, if you want your Lambda function to at most process one message only one time, we saw how you can do exactly once processing too. So both of those are configurable, and I would highly encourage you to take a look at those if you have that use case. So yeah, I think we covered everything we wanted to. So to recap, we went ahead and saw what SQS is and how it works at a high level. Then we went to the code, saw how to create a queue, how to get a list of all the existing queues, how to get a queue by name. We also saw two ways to write to the queue. One is writing one message at a time, and the other is writing a bulk of messages at once. We also saw how to read from the queue manually through the Python code. Then we talked about two different customizations you can do to the queue. One is to make it a FIFO queue, and the other is to guarantee exactly once processing. Both of these are not coming out of the box. You have to add some configuration to make the change. And lastly, we talked about an automated way of doing things where you use AWS's other services to create this ecosystem where as long as you're producing to SNS, everything should just work automatically. Yeah, so hopefully that was helpful. If you have any questions, let me know and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. And yeah, I'll talk to you on the next one. Bye-bye.